He was 17 the summer he vanished. The memory that jolts everyone awake in this town still begins the same way. Laughter, cold air off the water, a string of headlights cutting down the narrow road to the lake. By dawn, Simon Cooper, tall for his age, a shy grin that seemed to belong to someone else's photograph, was gone. 8 years later, a wristwatch found in a scrubby patch of land by a search crew would tilt everything back toward the light and pry open secrets people had been trying to bury. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated, and keep these stories coming your way. Drop your state in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. Imagine a lakeside party where teenagers toss a football and someone brings a small speaker that plays too loudly for anyone to hear the warning signs. A fight breaks out, then a sliver of time when two boys run into the dark. The next morning, the cops find shoes and a torn jacket, and the whole town grinds to a halt. Years pass with rumors and prayer vigils, cold files, and thank you cards to volunteers. Then, in a field 8 years later, an FBI evidence team picks up a simple wristwatch, engraved initials polishing in the sun. That watch becomes the thread that pulls two names from a fog. People ask how something so small could change everything. The answer is that time, always ticking, sometimes keeps its own day to justice. The lakeside night in late July 2001 started like any other. Teenagers from across Eugene converging on the quiet crescent of Fern Ridge, a place where high school friendships ignited and sometimes flared out by morning. Simon had been invited by a cousin. He arrived with a paper cup and a camera he loved to experiment with. He liked to freeze the light between faces. The party blurred into the sort of harmless chaos adults later called kids being kids. Someone lit a bonfire. Someone else drank too much. A group walked down to the narrow spit of sand that met the lake, where the road falls away and only stars remain. That night, something happened that the first officers on scene described as an altercation. What the teenager witnesses remembered was a heated exchange between Simon and a pair of other teens, two boys who'd been at several parties that summer. Rumors filled in where memories failed. Some said the boys had been joking and it escalated. Others claimed there had been pushing and a bottle raised. A few, quieter voices said Simon had been attacked. People argued about the meaning of attack. Nobody wanted to say the word murder out loud in a town that had never before had to learn how to hold such a thing. Detective Rosa Hall, who would later become the face of the case, was on the force the night the call came in. She remembered the way the water swallowed sound, how the crowd's energy turned to the hollow, vibrating silence that follows any discovery of tragedy. "We combed that shoreline until our boots were soft," she would tell a reporter years later. "We took statements from anyone who'd been there. We photographed everything. We logged every piece of clothing, every cigarette, but in those first frantic hours, the trail went cold. The only evidence they had then was a scattering of footprints, a camera with blurred images, and a pair of shoes found some distance from the water. The initial investigation focused on questions the town couldn't ignore. Who had been at the party? Who had left early? What had been said? And whether someone had seen something they hadn't told the police. The detectives canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed parents over coffee in living rooms and under fluorescent lights in interview rooms. The two boys suspected by a handful of witnesses were questioned. Names were written in notebooks. Statements contradicted one another. In the end, there wasn't enough to charge anyone. The DA's office said the evidence was circumstantial, and the case moved into the fragile, unbearably slow geography of a cold file. Cold files gather dust and grief in equal measure. For Simon's mother, Maria, every day without an answer was a small act of dying. She put his shoes on a shelf, kept his camera battery charged, and drove to the lake on quiet mornings. Friends organized vigils. Candles lit the darkness. Telethons and bake sales raised funds for continued searches. The town divided in ways that polite people hate to recognize. Some insisted the boys were guilty and had gotten away with it. Others warned against scapegoating, worried about the consequences of rushing to judgment. Guilt in the public imagination is reckless fuel, It can propel an investigation, or it can destroy lives. Years passed. The community's attention wandered to other headlines, other emergencies. The detectives assigned to the file changed. The technology that could have helped in 2001 matured in small, decisive ways. Databases improved. CCTV networks grew. Forensic analysis became more sophisticated. Detective Hall never stopped bringing Simon's case to meetings. Cold is not dead, she liked to say. Cold is waiting. In 2009, a new lead arrived the way most cold case leads arrive, messy, incomplete, and buried inside someone else's work. An investigator from a neighboring county, reviewing property where teenagers had been known to gather, found what looked like a broken watch clasp tangled in the brambles. It was mundane. A corroded stainless steel wristwatch with initials faintly scratched on the back. The property had been the subject of other inquiries. No one saw it at first, but the person who found it remembered the Simon Cooper case and thought to pass it up the chain. When the wristwatch was logged into evidence, the FBI took an interest. They'd been building relationships with local law enforcement, lending resources and technology that strained the budgets of small departments. The watch itself didn't scream case closer. It had fingerprints long gone, metal dulled by rain and time, and a strap with one snapped loop. What made the FBI take it seriously was not the watch alone, but the way it fit a long, aching pattern. A witness had recalled seeing a watch on one of the boys that night. Another had described the initials on an accessory. DNA and fingerprint techniques had improved enough that traces thought lost might be recovered. The forensic lab treated the watch like an archaeological find. Under microscopes, tiny flakes of material and fiber could speak if you knew how to listen. Latent prints, once unworkable, were enhanced. A partial print matched a juvenile record for one of the boys who had been questioned years before. It was not a slam dunk, it was a piece. The FBI cross-checked the initials engraved on the watch, followed transaction records where possible, and trawled through social media archives. Yes, there had been social media in the latter part of that decade, and it left traces. Slowly, a web tightened. Community members reacted the way a town always reacts to the smell of old pain rearing up again. For Maria, the watch was both salvation and terror. It told her that Simon's life had been strewn across places people kept stepping on without knowing, and it promised that someone might finally have to answer for it. For the families of the boys who would become suspects, it was the first time since the accusation that the cold had really looked like heat. Names that had floated around in bar talk and diner booths were now official again, pulled into a space with subpoenas and tapes. The arrest came on a warm morning in March 2009. It was quiet, almost ordinary. Detectives in plain clothes, the hum of a police car engine, a house that looked like many other houses on the block. The two young men, now in their mid-20s, were taken into custody without incident. The press called them the suspects and later the defendants. Their mothers protested. Friends wrote on social media defending them. The town held its breath as if it shared a single pair of lungs. At arraignment, the DA laid out the case that had been built over the previous months. The watch, the partial print, but also new witness statements. People who had been teenagers in 2001 and had not been willing to speak before were now adults who said fear had kept them silent. One by one, facts that had been whispered at kitchen tables found their place in formal testimony. The prosecution's argument was carefully scaffolded. The watch tied one defendant to the scene. Statements placed both defendants nearby during the crucial hours. Inconsistencies in earlier alibis suggested evasion. The defense pushed back on each point, attacking the chain of custody, the quality of the forensic matches, and the credibility of witnesses who had waited years to tell what they knew. Courtroom drama unfolded under the merciless glare of familiarity. Maria sat in the front row, Simon's picture in her lap like a talisman. She listened to the lawyers argue and felt like she was watching the choreography of grief, motions and objections, a dance with no music. The community split into camps again. Some rallied behind the accused, fearing miscarriages of justice. Others wanted to see a conviction and closure. The human cost of a criminal case which legal minds often compress into exhibits and precedent, was on full display. One witness's testimony proved decisive, not because of the swagger or the certainty with which it was delivered, but because of the tremor beneath it. A man who had been at the party, a teenager then, a contractor now, stood on the witness stand and described what he had seen in a voice that cracked with years of quiet. He recounted a moment he'd always regretted. He had walked away, convinced someone else would step in. He described the two boys running away from a beach with Simon behind them, the sound of splashing, and then waking up the next day to rumors he hadn't wanted to believe. Under cross-examination, he admitted his own shame at not speaking up earlier. The jury, watching not just facts, but the human element of contrition, listened. The defense attempted to paint a different picture. A gang of rumors that grew like fungus in the absence of light. Mistakes made under pressure. The unreliability of memory. They reminded the jury that people are fallible and that time erodes certainty. The prosecution responded with the slow, meticulous stitching together of the evidence. Forensics that had not existed in 2001, but which could now make connections. Witness statements that, when layered together, outlined a path no single witness could have invented. What made the courtroom scenes feel televised even without cameras was that each person in the room carried a story. One juror was a teacher who had seen the ripple effects of violence in a classroom. Another was a father who could not stop thinking about the parents of both the victim and the defendants. When the jury reached a verdict, it did so carrying the invisible weight of everyone who had watched over the years. The verdict was not unanimous in the town's mind. For some, justice had been done. For others, the case raised questions about the use of improved technology on old evidence and the moral complications of retrospection. 2 young men were convicted. The details of the sentences, the appeals that followed, and the legal maneuvers that ensued became a long series of documents and hearings that stretched for years. But what mattered in the immediate aftermath was that Simon's family, and a community that had carried the ache, finally had a formal determination that someone had been held legally accountable. Even with convictions, truth rarely lies tidily folded. Confessions came slowly and partly. One of the men gave a statement that was part apology, part deflection. He described a confrontation that spiraled out of control, hands and fear, and a moment that had gone too far. He insisted it had not been planned, that it had not been supposed to end like that. The other man's account differed in small but important ways. Both accounts acknowledged presence and involvement, but diverged on intention and the degree of violence. Prosecutors argued about degrees of culpability, the difference between an accusation that looks like manslaughter and one that will be read in the same breath as murder. If justice in a courtroom is a ledger, morality and memory are footnotes written in different inks. Some neighbors who had been vocal in their assumptions grudgingly admitted they'd been wrong. Others doubled down, convinced the system had favored one group over another. The town's racial tensions, which had been simmering under the surface for years, surfaced more openly in community forums and letters to the paper. The fact that the defendants were black teenagers complicated conversations about institutional distrust and profiling. People argued about whether the prosecution's focus reflected bias or the pursuit of truth. Local leaders called for calm and for honest conversations about race, poverty, and the way youth congregate in public spaces that feel, to some, like nowhere. Throughout the legal back and forth, the human loss remained. Simon's friends described him as quiet but proud of the smallest things. A Polaroid he'd taken of a sunset, a joke that always landed wrong, but that made them laugh. One son of a son spoke at a memorial and said the thing everyone else felt, that nothing in a courtroom could return Simon to the lake, to the camera, to the photograph of him on a summer night when he hadn't yet known the world could break someone. Rumors and lies had been part of the case from day one. After the arrests, more surfaced. Some people claimed someone else had been involved. Others swore that confessions had been coerced. A blog sprung up with anonymous posts arguing that law enforcement had rushed because of pressure to solve a high-profile case. Another local wrote open letters about how the town should have done more to protect its children. These voices, amplified by the internet's echo chambers, made it harder to know what was true. And yet, amid that clamor, a quieter truth remained. Evidence exists separate from narrative. Forensic traces are not immune to being interpreted. But when multiple forms of evidence converge, physical items, credible witness testimonies, and corroborative patterns, they create a stronger claim than rumor. One of the most wrenching parts of the story was the role of silence. People who knew things had stayed quiet for reasons that ranged from fear to shame to distrust of the system. Some were young then and feared retaliation. Others felt that no one would listen. Years later, when those pockets of silence were replaced by speech, the aggregate effect was undeniable. The ethical question that haunted the town was simple and brutal. What does it take to make someone speak? And when someone finally does, is it too late? Detective Hall never ceased being haunted by the things she didn't know. The missed gestures, the words not recorded, the nights when she lay awake imagining alternate endings. Yet she also found a strange solace in the watch, a small object that had bridged time and brought people back to truth. We don't always get our tidy endings, she would say, but evidence has a patient logic. Sometimes the thing that solves the case is not the big dramatic lead. It's a tiny, stubborn object that remembers who touched it. After the trials, the town attempted to stitch itself back together in public ways. Churches held interfaith vigils. Schools brought in mediators to talk to students about safety and conflict resolution. And community groups formed to make sure young people had supervised alternatives to unsupervised lakeside parties. There were apologies to awkward and necessary admissions from people who had spread rumors or who had been too quick to blame. But some wounds resist stitches. Parents who had lost children in other tragedies reached out to Maria. Mothers of the convicted men wrote letters asking for mercy. These small exchanges carried their own complicated grace. In private, Maria sat with the paradox of partial closure. The convictions were a legal recognition of what she had felt since the day Simon disappeared. But they did not feel like a complete explanation. She could not press her palm into the past and smooth it. She could not get the last photograph back. Still, there were moments when she felt free to talk about Simon as if he were still alive. She would tell stories about his awkward dance moves, his pride in getting a chemistry problem right, the way he hummed when he cooked. Those memories were stubbornly real in a way that courtroom verdicts cannot fully capture. The case also forced a community reckoning on the responsibilities of watching. What do you owe when you see something wrong? Many who had been teenagers that night later admitted they had been paralyzed by fear or confusion, that the instinct to avoid entanglement had been stronger than the impulse to act. Schools introduced programs teaching students how to intervene safely. Parents began to insist on numbers and check-ins. Local organizations offered workshops on conflict de-escalation. It felt like a town collectively inventing better practices out of grief. Yet the story was not finished. In the months after the conviction, as appeals wound their slow course and the families tried to find equilibrium, a small group of reporters and independent sleuths turned their attention to a different angle. They found a faded Polaroid in an old high school yearbook, taken the summer before the lake night, that placed one of the defendants near the water with a friend who had never been mentioned in the trials. The friend was in the country now, hard to reach. The reporters pushed. The police reopened minor leads, and historians of the case began to catalog inconsistencies that still worried them. It was then, as the community breathed what it thought might be its last collective exhale, that a new piece of evidence surfaced. An anonymous letter arrived at the DA's office, short, typed, and insisting that the watch, while important, did not tell the whole story. The letter hinted at another presence, someone who had been seen arguing with Simon days before the party. It asked only that investigators look where the kids don't want you to look. The letter's origins proved frustratingly difficult to trace. Its arrival reopened old fears. Had the convictions covered the truth, or only part of it? Detectives obliged. They followed the tip to a storage unit where boxes of old things had been left by a family who had moved and not updated their address. Inside, alongside toys and paperwork, they found a battered cassette tape labeled with a date close to the party. An analog recording that, if authentic, might contain voices. Forensic audio analysis could clarify what was said and who spoke, but the process was painstaking and expensive. The town watched as official channels responded with careful language. "We are examining the items." For some, that meant hope. For others, it was a fresh, unhealed rupture. And so the case that seemed to have reached its legal conclusion drifted back into a quieter ambiguity. The convictions remained on the books, the sentences being served. But the possibility of unresolved threads gave the entire narrative a brittle edge. Maria, who had learned to brace for the unexpected, felt the old dread return in a different costume. Not the paralyzing grief of the first days, but a sharper, restless curiosity. Did she want another answer? Was she ready for a truth that might complicate the one she had finally received? The documentary-style recounting of these events does not end with neatly tied conclusions. Real lives, we have learned, resist tidy endings. What is true is that a small object, a wristwatch, can change the direction of an investigation and force the present to reconcile with the past. That forensic advances can give voice to evidence that once lay mute, and that people who were teens once become adults who must carry the weight of what they saw and what they did. In the months after, a local filmmaker who had followed the case since the beginning began editing hours of footage. Interviews with Maria, with Detective Hall, with jurors, with the parents of the convicted. He pieced together the little things that form memory. The way sunlight falls on a shore, the rhythm of a mother's breath as she remembers her child. He included scenes of a lake in slow motion, blank and indifferent, and audio clips of testimony that showed both the frailty and the courage of human memory. The film ends, for now, with the image of a watch face, its hands forever frozen at a time that refuses to be invited back. The filmmaker leaves the audience with a question rather than a conclusion. What does justice look like after so many years? The camera pans to the lake, then to Maria standing on the shore. The photo of Simon held close to her heart. Her voice in the film's final line is soft and steady. "We got an answer," she says. But there are always more answers to find. The cliffhanger, the reason this story will be continued, is not a cheap plot twist, but the patient reality of evidence left to be found, of letters that arrive with new questions, of human memories that shift as guilt, shame, and time rearrange themselves. The cassette tape sits in a lab waiting to be examined. The anonymous letter remains an open door. There are faces on the edges of the original investigation that have yet to be looked at closely. And there are families who want to know whether the convictions were the last word or merely the beginning of a longer truth. This is the kind of case that refuses comfortable endings. It demands that a town look at itself in the mirror and ask what it will change. It demands that parents teach their children how to step in safely, that friends hold each other accountable, and that systems tasked with investigating violence remain relentless in the face of time. It demands, above all, that we continue to ask, not for vengeance, but for a clarity that honors what was lost. If there is a single lesson sown through all these proceedings, it is that time is both enemy and ally. It can erode memory until nothing remains, but it can also work like a patient hand that reveals what was hidden. The watch was found because someone remembered to look. The convictions came because people finally spoke. And the unresolved corners, the lines that do not yet meet, are a sober reminder that truth, like justice, is often a long game. We will return to the cassette tape, the anonymous letter, and the new questions the filmmakers asked when they demanded that the scene be revisited. There are witnesses who have yet to be interviewed, neighbors who have kept secrets, and a map of human choices that has not been fully traced. For now, the community of Eugene breathes with a mix of relief and unease, knowing that the slant of sunlight on the lake can look the same in 2 different years, but hold very different stories inside it. Simon Cooper's photo sits framed on a mantel in his mother's house. The camera he loved rests on a shelf. People pass by and sometimes look at the frame and see only a boy who loved sunsets. Others see the seams of a community altered by an unsparing event. The watch, when it is displayed in the evidence room, is a mute object that speaks loudest to those who have held its silence. It tells a story of time taken too soon and time that finally, slowly, gave something back. They had promised one more look. It was the kind of promise people make when grief has taught them to keep searching, even when searching only circles the same patch of dark. The cassette tape, the Polaroids, the anonymous letter, each had been small, stubborn things that refused to let the town of Eugene go quietly back to its ordinary routines. Now 8 years after the watch pulled 2 names from the fog, a team that had once thought the case ended was convinced there were threads left to follow. Detective Rosa Hall had aged into the creases of the work. She moved with the patience of someone who had learned to sit with uncertainty and to read the small things that other people dismissed. She listened as the audio forensics team described what they'd found on the cassette. A rough recording, the hiss of tape, laughter in the margins, an argument that rose and fell like wind over the lake. There were no tidy confessions on the tape. There was, however, a sound that made every hair on her arms lift when she heard it with the expert ears of the analysts. A voice layered behind the others, low and careful. A voice that had not been named in the trials. "It's only a few seconds," the analyst said, "but we can isolate it. We can run voice comparisons." When Hall requested the cross-check, she did it quietly, because she had learned how explosive quiet could be once an ordinary name became a lead. The tape's presence had already changed the balance. The 2 men convicted in 2009 had exhausted some appeals. Their families, bruised and weary, watched the renewed attention with a mixture of hope and dread. Some believed this new evidence might finally show that the men had been scapegoats in a panic. Others feared that it would only reopen wounds without offering new truths. Maria Cooper, who had allowed herself the fragile relief of conviction, now returned to a more guarded posture. She had learned how hope and grief could both burn in a single breath. The forensic lab worked with the kind of obsessive care that makes the slow-moving justice system possible. They enhanced, cleaned, and replayed the cassette until the hiss dropped away and the voices stood out like small boats on a black sea. Under the clatter of teenage voices, a man's voice threaded through, intimate, even conspiratorial. It said a name in passing, Mitch, then another term that sounded like a nickname. There was also the unmistakable clack of keys, and at one point a distinct mechanical sound that an investigator recognized instantly. The click of a heavy, old-fashioned lighter being opened. Small things, but in a town where everyone had a memory of every detail of that night, small things mattered. Voice analysts ran the sample against hours of interviews the police had recorded in 2001 and in later testimonies. They ran it against public radio appearances and the local access footage the town loved to archive. One match, tentative at first, then growing in confidence as more algorithms and human ear confirmation aligned, pointed to a single man, Mitchell Argyle, known to everyone as Mitch Argyle. Mitch had been a fixture in Eugene, a volunteer youth soccer coach, a regular at town council meetings, a donor to the high school scholarship fund. He taught civics at the Adult Education Center and wore his community involvement like a badge. To the people who knew him, he was the kind of civic scaffolding that holds smaller towns together. Detective Hall felt the world tilt. That the voice might belong to Mitch Argyle was itself destabilizing. But the harder blow came when the digital forensics team pulled something from the Polaroids recovered from the storage unit. An old instant photo, margins faded with time, showing teenagers on a dock the summer before the party. In the corner of the image, a hand, adult-sized, rested on a boy's shoulder. The hand wore a ring, a plain band with a small, unusual engraving on the inside. Hall had seen the engraving before, when evidence technicians had cataloged a watch years earlier. That same engraving had been noted, but not matched. It read, faint as an obituary. The community's reaction when this name leaked, first to detectives, then to reporters and social media, was visceral. Mitch Argyle embodied everything the town liked to believe itself to be: involved, responsible, moral. The idea that he might be anywhere near the original crime scene or more disturbingly, that his voice could be on the cassette, set people's stomachs to a sick flip. Some refused to let themselves consider it. Others, the corner-sitters and late-shift baristas who had watched Mitch's speeches over the years, said they'd noticed things that hadn't fit. When detectives knocked on Mitch Argyle's door early one morning, the town held its breath. Cameras, many older ones now relegated to the web, recorded the scene as he was asked to come down to the station. He was calm, his face the practiced neutrality of someone who'd spent a life in the public eye. On the stoop, an elderly neighbor stepped forward and said, "Mitch taught my boy to tie his first cleats." The statement hung in the air like a prayer. At the station, Hall did not want a dramatic confrontation. She wanted answers. She played the isolated clip for Argyle in a small, fluorescent room with carpet scuffed by chairs. He didn't flinch when he heard the voice, at least not visibly. When pressed, his lawyer explained away the match as misidentification. Mitch's alibi for the night of the lake party was thin, but not impossible. He had been seen at a diner across town, and the owner swore by the register tape. Hall and her team, however, were not satisfied with simple denials. As the investigation expanded, reporters dug into every corner of Mitch Argyle's life. They found receipts, charitable contributions, and a set of keys to a storage locker, the very one where the cassette and Polaroids had been kept. Mitch claimed he had no memory of renting a locker. The discovery unnerved people. Why would a local leader have a storage unit filled with items that tied him, however tangentially, to a scene of crime? The more detectives asked, the more small discrepancies surfaced. A neighbor who'd written an angry letter to the paper some years back about teenagers using the lake late at night suddenly remembered seeing a man's silhouette near the boathouse on one occasion. A former player from a youth soccer team said Mitch had sometimes driven kids to the lake to teach them resilience. The phrase sounded harmless enough until you layered it with the not harmless things people were starting to say in low voices. The new evidence demanded a new legal choreography. The DA's office convened, reviewing the old file and the new items, deciding whether to bring charges or to continue investigating. Public meetings, once calm, filled with people pointing fingers and demanding answers. The town's pulse quickened in a way that felt like both hope and danger. The possibility of rooting out more truth felt like safety to some and like accusation to others. Meanwhile, as detectives and prosecutors maneuvered through search warrants and subpoenas, the filmmakers, who had been following the case since the Watch, were working on a second, deeper piece. Their documentary, which had promised to finish the story, now had an arc that neither they nor the town had anticipated. They wanted to show the good and the ugly of Eugene, the way a single event could split a community into the very kinds of tribes it would later have to bring back together. They requested background footage, old school tapes, anything that might place faces where they needed to be placed. The production room became a temple of small discoveries. A shot of Mitch standing with teens at a fundraiser. A clip of a man with a similar voice answering a question about curfew enforcement. A shaky handheld video of a bonfire where someone's hand obscured part of a face. Then one afternoon, Maria Cooper called the filmmaker. She had been at the courthouse for months. She had attended hearings, watched appeals, and sat through testimony with a patience that had been tempered by years of grief. "There's something at the bottom of Simon's camera," she said. Her voice was small but urgent. "I never looked properly. I thought I knew what was on it, but there's a file I didn't open. Can you come?" They found it in a folder mislabeled and hidden beneath vacation photos. A little QuickTime file created the same weekend as the party, time-stamped barely an hour before Simon vanished. It showed a doc, a handful of teenagers, and Simon laughing as he pointed the camera at the sky, like someone who wanted to catch everything beautiful and silly about being young. Then the framing shifted, a shadow moved across the small screen, and the camera panned up, for a heartbeat too brief to be comfortable, but long enough to be undeniable. An adult face filled the frame. It was not one of the teens. It was a man with a familiar jawline, a man who smiled in a way that the camera picked up as almost practiced. He spoke, in a voice that was softer than the one on the cassette, but similar in cadence. "You kids ought to be careful by the water," he said to someone off camera. The man in the frame was Mitch Argyle. The footage moved slowly through the town like a cold wind. It changed the perception of everything. People who had once defended Mitch now found their statements caught up in new suspicion. The sheriff's office, which had supported the earlier investigation that led to the convictions, found itself scrutinized for what it had missed. An old complacency, the town's reliance on the model citizen, had eroded, and no one was sure what would fill the vacuum. Detective Hall, careful and steady, followed the trail the camera offered. The footage put Mitch on the dock within hours of the disappearance. That alone didn't prove everything. People can be in places they don't belong. They can say things they later regret. They can be, in the end, innocent of the worst charge. But this tape, combined with the cassette and the watch's faint engraving, made a mosaic that could not be ignored. As Hall prepared a search warrant for Mitch's home, she found her inbox filling with messages from people who wanted to be heard. One of those messages was from the most unlikely of sources, a woman who had once been a regular at the church Mitch attended. She wrote that Mitch had confided in her once years ago about the weight of keeping secrets for him and his friends, that he had said, offhand, that community work required tough choices. The woman's letter was tentative, incomplete, but the seeds of it, when placed alongside the cassette and the camera footage, grew into something detectives could no longer ignore. The warrant turned up surprises. In a small locked desk in Mitch's study, they found a cardboard envelope labeled with a date close to the party. Inside was a note, not typed, but written in a careful blockhand. "For when the time comes, they will ask. Tell them what you saw." The note had no signature. It had, however, a simple instruction: a phone number. Forensics traced the number to a burner phone that had been active in 2001 and 2002, and then again briefly in 2009. The phone's records were not complete, but the fragments suggested patterns. Calls late at night, calls that connected to numbers tied to houses around the lake. All of it pushed the investigation in a new, hard direction. Prosecutors prepared for an indictment not just of the two men already convicted, but of someone sitting, until then, in plain sight. Politics crept into the case. Mitch argued through his attorney that he was being unfairly targeted because he was easy to photograph and easy to vilify. His supporters held vigils in front of the courthouse to proclaim his innocence. Opponents said that the weight of evidence needed to be heard. On the day the grand jury returned an indictment, Mitch sat in the front row of the room as if he had been carved there. People craned their necks in the courthouse square outside, waiting for the release of the documents that would explain why a beloved community leader now faced charges that, if proven, would send him to prison for a long time. The press clucked like birds at a feeder, hungry for the details they would circulate until the town forgot to eat. The charges, when they were read, shocked the community. Mitch was accused of obstruction, of tampering with evidence, and the one that ripped open the town's simplest faith, of being present in a way that allowed the tragedy to occur. The indictment suggested he had played a role in persuading teens to keep quiet and had direct interactions that night. It did not allege he had carried out the attack himself, that the document carefully noted belonged to the convictions already in the books. But it alleged complicity of a kind the town had never imagined, that a man who taught civic virtue had used his authority to bend the truth around a terrible act. When the news hit, the reaction split into two avalanches. For some, the indictment felt like moral clarity at last, a balancing of scales that had been askew. For others, it felt like the final proof that the system was unreliable and susceptible to hysteria. The town, already bruised, found itself in a new era of neighbor-on-neighbor accusation. Coffee shops buzzed, church doors were closed early, and a school counselor spent afternoons answering the questions of teenagers who were learning, suddenly, how adult hypocrisy could look. Yet beneath the public drama, something quieter and far more dangerous began to unfurl. A pattern emerged in the interviews conducted by the prosecutors. the presence of a third actor, a name mentioned in half sentences and in the nervous gestures of older witnesses. He was never called directly in the indictment, but he appeared in the margins of recollection. A man who had the habit of taking pictures, an outsider who liked to stand just beyond earshot, someone who had been seen with Mitch at fundraisers. His name, when it surfaced, was Jacob Hale. Jacob Hale was not prominent in town. He ran a small landscaping business and did odd jobs for the high school. He had a quiet reputation for being a loner, the kind of person who watches the world from the edges and takes notes. Some remembered him for his camera, others for the boxes he kept in a garage behind his house. When detectives asked about him in past interviews, many had shrugged. Oh, that quiet guy? He liked the lake. Now with the new attention, those shrugs turned to antsy reconsiderations. Hall and her team approached Hale's property with the same procedural care they brought to every warrant. What they found in his garage made even the most seasoned officers pause. Neatly stacked boxes labeled and dated filled with Polaroids, cassette tapes, and VHS tapes, recordings of parties, of conversations, of things that were not meant to be in boxes at all. Some were innocent. Group photos, silly angles of teenagers. Others were not. They included footage of the dock from angles only someone trespassing behind the foliage could have captured. They included audio that mirrored the tape already in evidence, but in longer form, with voices that could now be placed and identified with greater clarity. Hale was taken into custody that afternoon. He did not resist. In the interrogation room, he sat with a calm that could be mistaken for composure. The tapes were played back to him, and his face twitched just a little when his own voice, soft, observant, leaned in the background like breath. He admitted, with a peculiar frankness, that he had filmed the parties. He told detectives that he had done so because he liked to study human behavior, because he was collecting images for a private project, because he did not want to be alone with the memories of his late brother. Excuses that had the ring of real feeling, but that also reeked of a mind that had found ways to justify trespass. The tapes in Hale's garage were the kind of evidence that terrifies communities. They made private moments public. They forced people to look at themselves in ways they had never expected. They also crucially provided a bridge between the watch, the cassette, and the camera file, strands that now braided into a narrative prosecutors could point to in court. Hale's footage placed Mitch at the dock at the precise hour the party curdled. It showed Mitch speaking to teens in quiet voices. It showed him gesturing toward the water. It showed a figure in the shadows, one of the men later convicted, moving with an urgency that the old testimony had minimized. With Hale's confession to having filmed sessions and to keeping the tapes, the case that had once seemed closed reopened into a larger, angrier shape. The DA's office prepared to add charges. Defense attorneys for the convicted men filed motions asking for a new look at their convictions in light of the new video evidence. Public anger curdled into something more combustible. Those who felt marginalized spoke about the years when their voices had not been heard. Those who had once defended Mitch or the system now found their allegiance tested. And then the revelation that no one expected came. It was a public screening. The filmmakers had arranged to show their updated documentary at the town small theater, a place where people went to see old films and where community groups held debates and charity fundraisers. The theater was full. People who had not left their houses in months were there to sit in the dim and watch their town's story unspool on the screen. Maria sat in the third row, her hands clasped to a photo she had promised herself she wouldn't look at during screening. But of course she did. Detective Hall sat toward the back, eyes alert. The film rolled through the familiar scenes. The lake, the vigil, the watch in close-up. It showed the new footage from Hale's box, enhanced and slowed, and the camera captured angles that made the dock look intimate and cruel at the same time. The audience stirred when the filmmakers flashed freeze frames and arrows and overlays to match voices to faces. Someone in the aisle whispered, "I can't believe this." Then near the end, the filmmakers brought up a sequence they had not intended to show that night. They had been given one last reel by Hale's lawyer, a file that had been overlooked, longer and grainier than the rest. It was a shaky, handheld piece, as if someone had been carrying the camera and didn't want to be noticed. The footage at first seemed mundane. A man walking along a path behind the houses near the lake, the kind of walk any resident took at dusk. Then the frame wavered and a small movement in the corner of the image tensed everyone. A hand reached out, guiding a teenager into the frame. The man's face, when the camera caught it in a blur, was familiar. It was the face of Councilman Richard Hale. He had been on the town council for 2 terms and had helped raise funds for the high school. He had presided over ribbon cuttings and had his picture with the mayor and with Mitch at several events. The face on the film was older, washed by the light of a camera that made everyone look older. But the jawline, the small mole on the cheek, the watch he wore, an identical band to the one at the center of the old evidence, were undeniable. The theater felt as if it were losing air. People shifted in their seats. Someone's phone buzzed and then went silent. Maria's hands cramped on the photograph in her lap. Hall, who had been watching the film that had already reframed half the town, felt a steadiness dissolve into a raw, hot realization. Richard Hale was in the back of the theater that night. He had come, as many had, to watch and to see his town reckon. When the freeze frame of his face filled the screen, he stood slowly. The camera on the stage found him. Reporters' eyes found him. In the full spotlight of noon-forgotten bulbs, his features hardened. He turned, walked down the aisle with the measured calm of someone who has always known how to speak in public. He passed the rows where parents sat, saw the teachers, the kids who had been teenagers that night years ago, and he raised a hand, the universal gesture of someone about to speak, to apologize, to deny, to explain. He did something no one expected. Instead of denying, instead of fleeing, he looked up at the projector and for the first time let his face show a fracture. His voice, when he spoke, sounded raw because it was not practiced. "Yes, that's me," he said. "I was there." The theater made the sound of its own collapse. Hall stood. Maria's cry came out of her like a struck bell. Mitch, sitting 2 rows in front of her, clutched his head as if the theater itself were spinning. People swore. Someone fainted. The film stopped in a way everything stops in a small place when something enormous lands on it. By talking. By making sure the world knows what happened. Richard Hale did not protest when officers moved toward him. The evidence on the film, combined with the watch's engraving and the tapes, made the moment inevitable. He was let out in cuffs as the town watched itself split down the middle, as if the town's face had been struck and the fissure showed a darker tissue beneath. But the final blow, the one that lashed at the edges of comprehension, came not with Richard Hale's arrest, but with what he said as he passed the theater doors. Reporters asked whether he had anything to say. He turned for a breath, his blue eyes catching the light, and he smiled in a way that made Hall's stomach drop. "You think you have it all," he said softly, almost conversational. "You think a tape and a few photos finish stories. You think a couple of names will satisfy the need to sleep at night. But you don't understand the town. None of you do." He looked directly at the camera, as if he were seeing through it. "You've only looked at the surface. The lake holds more than memories. It keeps secrets because we all asked it to. You can prosecute a few men. You can look at the tapes. But you'll never know everything unless you're willing to be the one who finds it." His statement, measured and eerie, landed like a gust of cold air. People in the square felt a primitive horror, a sense that what they had already discovered was only beginning. Discussion erupted into rumor. Some said he was merely trying to terrorize the town's fragile order. Others heard him like a confession that there were more names, more faces, people with better alibis and more power. A rumor is a campfire. The more people who gather, the higher the flames. What stunned everyone, what made the community real, was not merely that another respected man was implicated, or that tape showed angles never seen before. It was the last item found in Richard Hale's office later that night. A small leather-bound notebook, a ledger of sorts, with jammed, cramped handwriting and dates and shorthand entries. It listed names. At first there were only initials, then full names. The ledger cataloged meetings, rides, home payments in small amounts, gifts, and the odd notation, chilling and clinical, handled, beside certain dates. when detectives cross-referenced the ledger with phone records and with Hale's newly discovered calendar. Pieces clicked into place. The ledger's dates matched nights with activity at the lake and with persons who had been seen only briefly in the old accounts. It named players the town had never noticed, implied a network, not of random kids led astray, but of adults and youth bound in ways the town had never wanted to face. In the days that followed, arrests piled and then stalled. The town's institutions, the council, the school, the church, found themselves under a microscope. Parents who had once handed their children over to volunteers at the lake now asked who these volunteers were. People who had once found safety in the town's routines began to ask ugly questions about the price of that safety. The media called it a scandal. Some called it a revelation. Maria walked in a fog of public sympathy and private dread. She had wanted justice for Simon. She had never wanted vengeance, nor to pull the town apart. Now the question she could not answer was whether justice in the legal sense would ever be the right measure of the damage done to the community's heart. The final, most chilling moment came a week after Richard Hale's arrest. The DA's office, concerned about further leaks, called a press conference to lay out the next steps. The square in front of the courthouse thrummed with the same nervous energy it always did when a small town faced a big story. Cameras glinted like eyes. People stood shoulder to shoulder. Maria was there, holding Simon's photograph like a map. Hall stood beside her, hands in her coat pockets, trying to look like someone who could hold a story steady. The DA spoke about indictments, about the ledger, about the tapes. He acknowledged the pain and promised thoroughness. Then, as the conference closed and reporters packed up, a paper slipped from the folds of the ledger and fluttered to the ground. Someone stooped to pick it up. It was a receipt, old, brown at the edges, for a ring purchased at a pawn shop downtown, dated the summer of the party. The ring's description matched one photographed on Hale's hand in earlier footage. The receipt had a name scribbled on it in a hurried hand. M.A. People in the crowd looked at each other in silence. Then a voice from the back spoke with a clarity that froze the blood in many throats. "You think this is the bottom?" the voice said. It belonged to an older man who had been a judge in the town for decades. A man remembered for stern lectures and for presiding over precisely the kind of morals the town liked to think it upheld. He had come to the press conference to see justice done. He folded his hands and looked at the ledger the way an archivist looks at a dangerous relic. "This ledger," he said slowly, "is not an ending. It's an index. There are names here that I cannot imagine being true. But ledger or no, there are always names people keep out of sight for reasons other than protection. Beware the satisfaction of simple answers. Monsters make children of us all when we let trust be an excuse for silence." It was a warning and a promise. The judge's words spread through the gathered crowd like a new wake. They looked at one another and realized with a cold dawning that the theater's screening, the arrests, the tapes, they had changed the town in ways that could not be put back together with legal filings. They had opened a door that, once open, would not easily close. That night, as the town slept uneasily, Maria drove to the lake. The water lay black and indifferent under the moon, its surface a mirror to a sky that didn't care. She thought of Simon as a boy with a camera who had tried to hold the light between faces. She thought of the watch, the tapes, the ledger, of all the small objects that had become the biography of what had happened. She thought of how a town could be both caretaker and accomplice when it sat on its hands and decided not to look. An hour later at the theater, a projectionist, a volunteer just trying to shut down after the screening, found a small envelope taped beneath the podium. Inside was a single folded piece of paper, written in the same cramped hand as the ledger, but shorter, almost a note someone would place on a bedside table. It read in a sentence that would be repeated until voices went hoarse. "You can indict men, you can point to faces, but remember, we are not finished. The lake keeps some truths for those who want to bury them. You have dug and you have found. Keep digging." No one ever found who had placed that note. Some said it was a taunt. Others said it was a warning to keep going. The town learned to live with both. Investigations continued. Trials stretched into years. Families divided and reunited in strange, new configurations. Some lost work, some lost friendships, some gained a brittle sense of vindication. And through it all, the lake sat like a mute oracle, holding its own counsel. The final chilling thing that stunned everyone. What made people say later that the whole town had tilted into a different plane of knowing was not a single arrest or a single confession. It was the ledger's implication that the town's quiet places had been fuller of complicity than anyone wanted to imagine, and that the simplest acts of kindness, coaching a team, sponsoring a scholarship, fixing a leak at the school, might have been a cover for darker commitments. On the day the story that had begun with a watch and a boy's disappearance finally reached courtroom judgment on a new set of charges, a hush had settled over Eugene that felt like the moment before a storm. The judge read verdicts with a voice that tried to be calm and failed. People cried in the public gallery. Maria, who had worn grief like a second skin for years, felt something she could not name fold open inside her. Justice, or what the law could compel, had been done in fragments. The ledger had unearthed a network that would be prosecuted, piece by piece. But as the gavel fell, a small shiver of unease moved through the building. Because justice in these cases is not a bell that rings once and then is done. It echoes, it prompts, it demands more. Outside the courthouse, the lake was a black smear on the horizon. Teenagers clustered under the streetlights. The judge's words, the arrests, the confessions, the taunting note, they all swirled into conversations that would last long past the headlines. People would rewrite the story of that summer a dozen times, each retelling smoothing edges, emphasizing different faces, blaming different failures. And still late in the night, when the town had quieted and the last of the cameras powered down, Richard Hale, led in handcuffs, escorted away by the very officers he had once greeted at town events, said something that many would repeat with a cold, incredulous hush. It was not a confession nor a denial, he said, as if reciting a fact remote from emotion. You've only just begun to wake up. Then, in a voice soft enough that it was half swallowed by wind and leaves, he added, and we liked it better when you slept. The words landed like a puzzle with missing an edge. Did he mean there were more hidden truths, more people who would have to stand in the light? Or was he speaking of a loss, of the steadiness that comes from not looking? The question that blanketed the town in the days and months that followed was this. If a community can sleep through small cruelties, what else will it overlook when it's awake? No one found an answer that felt satisfying. People learned to live with the ledger, with the arrests, with the theater note taped beneath the podium. They learned to teach their children to say something when they saw something. They learned to ask hard questions of their institutions. They learned, too, that the lake would keep its secrets until someone else remembered to look. In the years after, Eugene kept a habit of visiting small, bright things, vigils, funds, scholarship breakfasts, and it also kept a habit of looking over its shoulder. The town was no longer the quiet place that its older residents had remembered. It was painfully more honest. And yet the ledger's last entries, the entries that had hinted at names so high and connections so tight that they might have made some people laugh with disbelief, remained a gnawing presence. People would say later that the thing that shocked the most was not that adults had failed children, or that the network of silence had included people in positions of trust. It was that the town had the capacity to keep such a place for so long, and that sometimes the small objects we put aside, a watch, a tape, a photograph, are the only things with the stubbornness to refuse a comfortable forgetting. The ledger, discovered in a desk no one thought to open, was a map of that refusal. In the end, the community did not find peace. It found instead a wary vigilance. The watch remained in evidence. The tapes were archived for further study. The ledger was digitized and cross-referenced until every name it contained had been either investigated or explained away. The lake kept meeting the shoreline the way it always had, repeating its indifferent rituals. But people who remembered the summer of Simon Cooper also remembered the series of small things that had, finally, dragged the town into reckoning. And there, at the center of the story, where the awful light never quite faded, Maria kept a camera charged on her shelf. She would sometimes take it down and point it at nothing, as if the act of framing a moment might, in itself, be a kind of safeguard. She learned to sleep with one eye open. She learned to keep the list of names in her head like a litany, a prayer. She had wanted the case solved. She had wanted answers. When they came, dirty and messy and incomplete, she found herself both relieved and terrified. The ledger's final margin had a single line, scrawled in a hand that looked tired. Don't stop looking. It was a command, and it was a plea. It was too a promise that the town had learned the hard way. That truth is not a place you reach once and then leave. It is a landscape you must continue to walk, day after day, because the water that keeps secrets will not give them up without asking something of those who ask from. When people talk about that summer in Eugene, the one that began with a boy who vanished and a watch that started a chain, they often stop at the arrests or the trials. But the thing that keeps the story alive and that chills people who are inclined to think of small towns as sleepy and simple is the feeling that underneath the polite facades and civic smiles, there were rooms with locked boxes and notes taped beneath podiums and ledgers that recorded favors and crimes in the same ink. The community was stunned not just by the revelation of crimes, but by its own capacity for overlooking them. In the end, they understood something else, too. That waking up is not a single act. It is slow and stubborn. It is uncomfortable. It is relentless. And it is sometimes the only thing that keeps small towns from drifting into a future where secrets never surface. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery solved cold case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.